To start off, this script was being written in tandem with the episode covering Phantasy Star 1. This script was actually finished first. But I didn't record or upload it because I was very stubborn. I really wanted episode 1 to be about Phantasy Star 1. Welcome back to my strange little series where I try to make a sort of appreciation video for each game in the Phantasy Star franchise. I make no promises about the release schedule of these videos. Only that I will cover each game in some way, shape, or form, and I do mean each game. All of them. I'll get to Gaiden eventually. And stuff like that. This one's about Phantasy Star 2. The fistful of people who've actually seen my Phantasy Star 2 playthrough might be saying, "But Marcus, you've already made a bunch of videos about Phantasy Star 2. You played through the whole game. What are you even gonna say here? You can't do that weird journal thing you did for Phantasy Star 1. To which I would say, "You beautiful fool, you're talking to a YouTube video." That's a good question. I've thought to more or less make this video something of a review of the game now that I finished it, and my path through the game is very clearly documented. I've never done a video game review before, at least not as the main thing I do in a video. It's kind of a component of the Phantasy Star 1 video, but we'll see how this goes. One thing that a lot of reviews do that I think is kind of lame is when they just recap the entire game by quote-unquote analyzing each event in sequence, and it effectively is just spoiling the plot. So I don't want to do that in this video, as I am kind of considering it a review. Yeah, I don't even know if this is really a review thing. I don't watch that many reviews. This might just be I'm picking bad videos to watch. Luckily for me, this is kind of also the best way to go about this for the case of Phantasy Star 2, as on paper, there aren't that many events in Phantasy Star 2. Like, half of the game kind of isn't very much in terms of plot. Like, there's not that many cutscenes where characters move on their own independent of you. There's only a fistful of them, and the first one is the intro sequence, where Rolf gets his incredibly vague mission of going to Climatrol and doing things. Of course, with that start, we actually already run into a small issue that confused the hell out of me the first time I played the game. Unlike the cool youngest brother of the 2D Phantasy Star games, Phantasy Star 4, Phantasy Star 2 basically never tells you where you are in the game, except for one NPC in each town that mentions the name of the town. I believe it's intended that you go out of Paseo, through that tunnel, and then on the right there's a little roadblock, and that's where you find Darum, who's threatening people. On the first time I played this, before I recorded it, before the playthrough that I recorded, I never went over there. Yeah, so I didn't do that. And I didn't look up a guide the first time I played the game either. So I went the other way, found another town, and found a dungeon past that, and I just kind of assumed that that was Climatrol. I was very wrong. And the thing about that is that is the first dungeon I'm supposed to go to. But the thing about Phantasy Star 2 dungeons is that they're mostly about finding a thing. In the dungeon I found, I was meant to find a girl that had been kidnapped, and an item or two to progress the game past the roadblock. But I never saw the roadblock the first time, nor did I talk to, I think there's like some NPCs that mention Darum and like his kid and some people. I didn't talk to the NPCs the first time I played this game, like at all. So I just kind of bumbled around the dungeon for a while until I actually talked to the NPC up there. I had expected her to be a boss fight for my first time playing because I'm a modern RPG gamer. I played through a lot of modern RPGs. You get to an end of a dungeon, there's a person there. There weren't any people anywhere else in the dungeon. Must be boss fight time. It was not. So I was confused when she became an item in my inventory. Of course, I had limited options for where to go at that point, so I did end up finding Darum and triggering the whole scene where that all happens before too long. Then I ran into another problem. I didn't know there was dynamite in the dungeon, which is an item you need to blast open a door in a future dungeon, so I got stuck there. I know I figured it out eventually, because I know I got farther in the game than that before I did YouTube videos. But I don't remember, because that was a really long time ago. Here's another thing about Phantasy Star 2's progression. In most contemporary RPGs, progress is marked by mid-bosses and bigger boss battles. Phantasy Star 2 only has 4 boss fights. The first one is about halfway through the game, and the second one is a scripted loss. So really there's only 3 boss fights. Instead, you progress through the game by finding the things you need to progress to the next place to find the next thing you need. Little spoiler here, Climb Patrol is probably about the halfway point marker of the game. That initial quest gets sidetracked so much because getting into the damned place requires so much work, including 2 entire sticks of dynamite, 4 color-coded key cards, and a piano lesson. Without a guide though, as I didn't use when I first tried the game, well before I uploaded a video about it, you might never figure out what you need because some of the required items, and especially the piano lesson, are all hidden. The piano lesson, this is in the YouTube playthrough, it's out of bounds technically for the town. You have to walk a very specific path to even get there, or otherwise you walk out of town. While the opacity of progress is rather frustrating, especially to me, a gamer born in the era of voice-acted tutorials and the crazy taxi arrow, this idea of game progression is rather fascinating to me. Phantasy Star 1 has a similar sort of deal where instead of violence and battles marking the forward progress, those battles are the side effect of trying to find the key you need to progress. It's strongly possible that this sort of design philosophy was something pushed by Reiko Kodama, aka Phoenix Rie. For those unaware, Phoenix Rie was an important figure in Sega from 1984 up until her death in 2022. She did artwork for a large number of Master System and Genesis titles and was the lead graphic designer of Phantasy Star 2 specifically. Basically, if there's a Genesis game that you like, she probably had a hand in it at some point. I bring up her role here because she was quoted as believing that video games which glorify violence bring in a heavy male audience. And she was also noted for believing that women were a growing demographic of gamers. If you take those two ideas in concert with each other, you create this idea of a game that doesn't require as much violence to continue through to create a more balanced demographic of gamers. Also, I couldn't just not mention her in a video series about Phantasy Star. This franchise was a cornerstone of her work, and being the producer of the Sega Ages remakes, which includes the original Phantasy Star, was her last work before she passed. Character progression is also rather fascinating. Most of the stats in the game are going to be improved through equipment. This isn't to say leveling up is unimportant, but rather that most of your grinding in this game is going to be for money to get equipment rather than level ups, because equipment gets damned expensive in this game, dude. This leads to the somewhat explosive feeling of power, as new equipment makes certain sections feel very breezy, and then you get to the next section with much more difficult enemies, and then you have to grind for equipment again. So it's a very, very spiky sort of power feeling. In the playthrough that I did for this channel, this caused most of the upload gaps. I realized I needed strength for continue, and that was going to take a lot of grinding, and then I kind of procrastinated on it. I was like, oh, I'll do that off screen, and then I kind of just didn't for months. Thus, the playthrough took me actual real-life years. It can be a lot, and the combat isn't exactly exciting 90% of the time. Like I said, there's 4 bosses, and one of them is a scripted loss. And 2 of them are right next to each other at the very end of the game. Anyway, moving past the way progression works in this game, we have a lot to talk about the actual gameplay. For everything else, this game is still an 80s console RPG. There aren't all that many things going on here, since games back in the day only had to be one thing at a time. You didn't have to have a big world and mini games and side quests and this and that. Nah, games were much simpler, much more focused. You just kind of had to be an RPG. So there are 2 main methods of interacting with Phantasy Star 2: exploration and combat. Exploration can be further broken down into 2 main mechanics: walking and talking. I know, it seems ridiculous talking about walking and talking as mechanics in a video game, but hey, there's not really much going on here mechanically. Walking isn't anything special. If you've played a video game that wasn't a visual novel, you've probably interacted with a game like this. There's 4-directional movement, your party members follow your path exactly, all of which is very expected of the game of its time. There's 1 vehicle in this game, as opposed to the first game having 3. It's the hovercraft. Unlike the first game, it's not an item in your inventory, it stays in a physical place on the world map when you disembark. Thankfully, it does work with you whenever you use the Ryuker technique or use a teleport station. So you don't get soft locked by forgetting where you parked the car, so to speak. Talking is honestly the only way you'll survive this game if you make the poor decision to not use a guide. NPCs will tell you things, albeit characteristically cryptic for the 80s and 90s. Things about the area and possibly where to go. For instance, the piano lessons I mentioned a couple times. There's an NPC in that town who talks about a reclusive musician, which is probably the best hint you'll get out of the game. Also, I'm going to lump collecting treasure in with talking here because it's basically the same thing, but instead of getting a gameplay hint, you get money. Sometimes. Phantasy Star 2 does this thing, especially in certain areas where there's just useless bullshit in a lot of treasure chests. They don't do mimics, but you will open a treasure chest and it'll just say, "There's trash! Fuck you!" Granted, the items might also be cryptic to you because items do not have normal names in Phantasy Star games. The made items follow a naming scheme, so you can probably figure that out, but what's a telepipe? A moondew? If you don't already know what these are, you'll have to guess, because there isn't much for hint text in this game. And the same goes for techniques. Speaking of which, let's get into combat. Phantasy Star 2 uses a rather unique system of auto-battling. By default, any party member with a weapon is set to attack with the weapon. And you could just hit battle, and the fight will just play out in front of you. This is likely how almost all combat will go for a good chunk of the game, stopping the auto-battle occasionally to use a healing skill. Getting back to those, skills in Phantasy Star 2 onwards use something of a word-building system for their spell names. It goes prefix plus root word. Once you understand the root words, you're good to know how the prefixes are just power increases. For instance, res is resta, if you don't have a character limit. The second one is Gi-Res, or Gi-Resta, and then there's Na-Res, the best healer in the game. Other spells include, but are not limited to, Foy, Githu, Sar, and Megid. If you know what any of those do off the top of your head, you've played a game in this franchise before, because there's no way Foy just intuits as single target fireball to anyone outside of this game franchise. I don't believe you. There's one interesting feature of combat in Phantasy Star 2, the combat items. They're a fistful of items that can be equipped, but when used in combat as an item, they work as a spell without using any TP. This is very useful for grinding. The whole combat system is convenient for grinding, actually, because the combat items also get cursor memory, where in each battle will start with the character who used a combat item, as using it again by default. This is great, because Phantasy Star 2 is infamous for grinding. Every party member you get starts at level 1, so any new member you want to use is a new session of playing catch-up with levels and equipment. The effect of this is that I really only used 5 out of the 8 party members throughout the course of the game, and it's because you have to pick a 5th member after a point in the story. Speaking of, let's do a quick rundown of the party members who invade your home at one point or another. We have Rolf, the protagonist. He can do a little bit of everything. He uses swords and knives. He can use a shield, but not while using a sword, which is lame. Nai, who is honestly the mascot for this entry. If you see Sega acknowledge Phantasy Star 2, Nai will be there. She uses claws, which are called bars in English for some reason. I really thought she was carrying metal pipes with her up until I got the laser bar, and I was like, oh, well, that doesn't sound right. Rudolf Steiner, or Rudo. He is the Odin of this game, down to the blonde hair and inability to use techniques of any kind. He has a lot of HP and access to guns, so he's far from useless. Speaking of, I don't think I put this in the script. Guns work in this game a little differently. Some of them, they're weird. So you have shotguns, which do what guns did in Phantasy Star 1, where guns in Phantasy Star 1 do set damage to everyone. The shotgun does a set amount of damage, and it spills over to enemies in the same enemy group. It's weird, and unless you read how they work in like a guide or something, like you could probably go the whole game and go like, I don't understand how these fucking shotguns work, and no one would blame you. Anyway, next up we have Amy. She's the dedicated healer of the group. Her damage output is going to suck no matter what you do, but for her healing power alone, she's incredibly helpful to have. She can use some guns, but only the worst guns. Hugh, I didn't use him, but apparently he has techniques specifically for use against biomonsters. This makes him entirely useless for sections of the game, and specifically while you're being chased by the cops on Motavia. Then there's Anna, who introduces a new sort of archetype to these early games, which is the badass hunter lady. Her access to techniques is somewhat limited, but she has an attack buff, which goes pretty well with any party combination. She introduces slicers to the franchise, a boomerang weapon that's probably the second coolest weapon type in the franchise's history, in my personal opinion. Josh is the flip side to Hugh. He's really good against machines. This makes it really hard to level him up, as all the low-level enemies are biomonsters. Last but not least, we have Sheer Gold. She's a thief, and the only way to get the ability to save anywhere with an item called the Visiphone. Yeah, you may recognize that name if you've played PSO2. Unfortunately, she leaves the party every time she steals, so if you have her Desolus, you'll have to go all the way back to the Obscure Airport in order to go back to Motavia, back to Rolf's house, in order to get her back into your party. And until then, you have 3 party members. Let's move on to the story. Like I already said, I'm not going to go blow by blow through the story, but I will be talking about it kind of like as a whole here, so consider this your spoiler warning. I'll give you a second. Alright, time's up. The game starts with a dream, one of my favorite ways to open a game, personally. The dream appears to be one of the end events of the original Phantasy Star. This is your only hint for most of the game that you, the protagonist, are connected to Alice in any way. Once you wake up, showing one of the only scene arts in the entire game, with Rolf sat awake here, you brush off the dream and go to work. In the central tower of Paseo. That's where you get the mission to fix the climate. You know, average Tuesday kind of job, no biggie. So, Rolf goes home to get ready, and then, ugh, this cute anime girl that happens to live with you wants to come with you, and she's just wearing a purple leotard for some reason. What an awful situation. Am I right? After Nye forces herself into your party, the game truly begins. There's a bunch of extra exposition in the opening of the game, if you let it get there. I didn't when I first played the game, and didn't know it was there for a little while. From there on, the story's pretty light, as in after Darum kills himself in the tunnel, there isn't really any story scenes until Nye dies to Nye First. Between the battle with Nye First and landing on Desolus, though, there's a lot. There's a lot. Like, you go to jail, you get arrested, and then you get, like, saved by space pirates. Like, this all happens very quickly, I should mention. And then after landing on Desolus, there's a fair amount of space until more story happens. And then you get the last sprint. You meet Lutz, he gives a bunch of exposition, and then sends you to the mothership Noah. Okay, yeah, I'm sure this sequence wasn't confusing to gamers in the 80s at all. In that final dungeon, we fight Dark Force. Of course you do. It's a Phantasy Star game. You have to fight Dark Falls at some point or another. Then you fight the real final boss and get a twist ending that I choose not to spoil, knowing full well that it's a 30-plus-year-old game and no one would be mad at me for talking about it. And also, I already have a video showing you the ending. If you really want to know, go there. Yeah, that's right. All in all, the story is fine. There's a bit after Nye dies that I have quibbles with, where the lady who makes the clones to revive the party says she can't make clones of Nye at all, which is bullshit, because you definitely can, and have during the entire game up to that point. I've been told that was a localization issue, so I guess it doesn't matter. A common complaint is that the game doesn't really talk about the characters of the party at all. They introduce themselves at your house before going through your fridge or whatever the party members you aren't using do. But the only other dialogue they have is at the end of the game, with one more line each. I'd argue that character writing wasn't really a focus of RPGs at the time. The time being approximately Dragon Quest II, Final Fantasy II era. Phantasy Star 1 didn't give their cast much screen time either. RPGs at the time were just a lot more event focused, telling you about what happens to the world due to the story, instead of about who's doing it. In that sense, the algo system is really the protagonist of this game. The thing that sets PS2 from its contemporaries, though, is the supplemental games. Phantasy Star 2 has text adventures for each of the party members. That will be its own video when I've gotten around to playing them, but because of that, some defenders of this game will tell you that justifies the lack of story in the game itself, but that's stupid. Also, I've really only heard like one person say this. I said defenders. It's there's like, there aren't that many defenders of this part of the game. There's like 1 or 2 people. First of all, none of the text adventures released anywhere but Japan officially, which stings. Secondly, I don't want to play 9 games to understand 1 game. Like that's just that's a weird thing to ask. So all in all, I think Phantasy Star 2 is a decent RPG with a bit of a lacking story that fits in with other RPGs of the time, and an atrocious difficulty curve. Seeing as this is a review, I should give it a score. I'll give Phantasy Star 2 a 4 out of 10. I'd really only recommend this game if you are someone who is like me. You really like Phantasy Star and you like old RPGs, and if you're planning to play the game, there's a guide on a website called Fantasy Anime. It's really good. I never would have beaten the game without it. The text of the guide is very easy to read. They also have PNGs of all the maps, if that's more your speed, if you want to look at the things. The last part I have to say here is about this game's role in the franchise, and gaming as a whole, which I want to add on to all the rest of this videos of the series. I didn't put this in Phantasy Star 1's video because, well, I mean, it just wasn't that there wasn't a franchise yet. The aesthetics of Phantasy Star 2 were overall a lot more futuristic than the first game, which became one of the defining features of the franchise that makes it stand out from its contemporaries at the visual level. This being the second time Dark Falls appears means it kind of established it as a monster of the tradition, as part of like the tradition of the series, who shows up in almost every game in the franchise, though many are visually entirely different from the blue boy that is in this game. In gaming at large, this was one of the first JRPGs to really establish who characters were, and Final Fantasy II had released just a few months ago when this game came out, but I would argue that this game goes a little further with attempting to establish personalities and jobs, especially as those jobs relate to combat roles and capabilities. Well, this is probably a rather short video. I don't know. This script was only 7 pages. I think the Phantasy Star 1 was double that. I think it was 15 pages actually. So that's really all I have to say on this video. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. Please consider subscribing. I looked at the analytics for the Phantasy Star 1 video, and only 0.1% of the people who watched that video were subscribed. Which oofga. Oof. Maybe don't subscribe. Maybe that'll just show you more of my videos. I don't know. The next video I plan is probably going to be Phantasy Star 3, because I'm not really sure when I'll get around to the text adventures. And until the next we meet, stay safe out there.